Lesson 13.3. Welcome back, grade 7s. How did these new technologies help to contribute to Canada's identity? We're going to learn about that and more. So stick around and let's learn something. .3 is our lesson today. In what ways did new technology contribute to the development of Canada? This is all about technology and identity. These technologies that were being introduced, the technologies that are continuing to be introduced, they change people's lives. In our story of Canada, these new technologies brought new ways to travel and new ways to communicate as well. So we'll be talking about the automobile, airplanes, and radios and whatnot. And we're going to start with the horseless carriage. This individual right here is in a horseless carriage. It's the automobile, it's the car. This was introduced, the car was introduced, the automobile was introduced before the First World War. And it was actually, the first cars were powered by electricity and or steam. But electricity and or steam back then were not very reliable and not easy to use, so gas engines quickly became the norm. Now, this is a changing technology, it's a new technology, but not everybody enjoyed this new technology. Farmers, for example, they didn't like what this technology was doing to their horses. So what does the government do? They respond. So a law gets passed. If you're driving a horseless carriage, if you're driving an automobile, you must, as a driver, you must stop so that the horse is able to pass. The horse has the right of way, okay? And rules change, laws change when it comes to automobiles as we adapt, okay? Now that we've got bike lanes and pedestrians and mass transit and things like that, everybody is trying to kind of fit in line with this transportation. The prices of cars began reducing because of the assembly line, because of the factories. So in 1924, a Model T Ford, $395. Not bad. The weekly minimum wage at that time in 1924 was $14. So yes, it is going to take some time to be able to get this car purchased, but it will be affordable to Canadians. Okay, you're looking at roughly 30 weeks or so, maybe a little bit less, to be able to afford this car. So not too bad. So by 1929, 1.2 million cars were on Canadian roads, which requires now better roads. Prior to the First World War, our roads were dirt roads. Great for a horse and buggy, great for pedestrians sometimes, not so great for the automobile. And Thomas Willoughby, I have heard of this individual many, many times. This is probably going to be the first time you've heard of him in grade 7 social here. But he was a journalist. This is a picture here. And he traveled from Halifax to Vancouver. You travel from Halifax to Vancouver today in a car, 5 days maybe, let's say. 48 days it took him to travel from Halifax to Vancouver. 48 days, that's incredible. Along the way, he experienced flat tires. He needed a ferry at some point, and he needed the train at some point. And it wasn't until 1942 that we see a paved road from coast to coast. And now we have that Trans-Canada Highway. We've got the Yellowhead Trail here in Canada. These are cross-Canada highway systems that exist. So it's because of the automobile that these things exist. Okay, that's great. Cars. What about airplanes? Well, in 1903, the first airplane took off in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. It's not like a plane today. It didn't go that far. The Silver Dart in 1909, which was designed in Nova Scotia, took its first flight on Canadian soil in 1909, and it flew for a kilometer and not that high off the ground. But the technology improved fairly quick And by the First World War, we're starting to see planes used as weapons of war to fight in these battles. So between 1903 and the start of the First World War, we see a vast improvement in this technology. After the First World War, as Canadian pilots were returning home, they came home continuing wanting to fly. They had these skills that they developed. So they came home to fly bush planes. Now, these are not passenger planes, these are bush planes. So they did transport some people, but mostly bush planes were used to spot fires, like forest fires in the distance. They were used to haul mail, not deliver mail from home to home, but transport mail from town to town and then gets processed there. They did some aerial photography, and of course, they did some rescue work. So we've got transportation, we've got the automobile, we've got airplanes, but what about communication? Well, the age of radio begins in the 1920s when radio partnered up with newspapers to fulfill this mass media component of our lives for people to find out about what's going on and to find out about each other. And in 1920, the first radio broadcast in Canada happened in Montreal in 1920. And within 10 years, we now had 60 radio stations across Canada. And then 20 years later, in 1950, TV stations start. And this is going to contribute to Canadian identity because the early broadcast signals, especially that of radio, did not recognize where borders began and where they ended. So radio signals cross the borders. And the early radio signals did come to Canada from the United States. And this made the government fearful that we would be losing our Canadian identity because we would have an American bias when it comes to radio. So in 1936, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, the CBC, which still exists today, was created. And the goal of the CBC, the goal of the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, was to bring Canadian voice to radio so we can save our Canadian identity. And today, the CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, has stations all over Canada broadcasting in both official languages of French and English. All right, I want you to head over to your notebooks and complete the questions for this part of the chapter.